London, 1942. The rain hammers against the windows of a nondescript building on Baker Street. Inside, a young woman named Odette Sansom sits across from a British intelligence officer who slides a small wooden matchstick across the table. What happens next will save countless lives and remains one of the most elegant solutions to a problem that has plagued resistance fighters, special operatives, and security professionals for over 8 decades. This is not a story about breaking into places. This is a story about keeping people out. And the ingenious method developed in the darkest days of the Second World War continues to work on locks manufactured this very year. The problem began in occupied France in the spring of 1941. Allied agents and resistance fighters faced a deadly challenge. After completing sabotage missions or intelligence gathering operations, they needed time to escape. But the buildings they fled from, whether German headquarters, supply depots, or communication centers, had doors that opened easily from both sides. The pursuing soldiers could follow within seconds. What was needed was a way to lock a door from the inside that couldn't be opened from either side, buying precious minutes for escape. Traditional locks and keys wouldn't work. You couldn't lock yourself inside a room you needed to escape from. Barricading doors took too much time and made too much noise. Agents needed something fast, silent, and utterly reliable, something that could be carried in a pocket without raising suspicion, something that would turn an ordinary door into an impenetrable barrier, at least for the critical minutes needed to vanish into the night. The solution came from an unlikely source. A locksmith who had fled Belgium after the invasion began working with British intelligence. His name has been lost to classification, but his contribution changed the nature of clandestine warfare. He understood something fundamental about the pin tumbler locks that were standard in the 1940s and remain the most common type of lock worldwide today. These locks have a weakness, but it's not the weakness you might think. To understand this technique, we need to understand how these locks actually work. Inside a standard pin tumbler lock, there are several pairs of pins. When you insert the correct key, it pushes each pin pair to exactly the right height, allowing the cylinder to turn. But here's what the Belgian locksmith realized. If you could jam those pins in a specific way, the lock wouldn't turn for anyone, not even with the correct key. And if you did it right, the lock would appear completely normal from the outside. The method he developed was breathtakingly simple. Take a thin sliver of wood, about the size of a wooden match but precisely shaped. Insert it into the keyway at a specific angle. Break it off flush with the lock face. The fragment would wedge between the pins and the cylinder wall, creating a jam that couldn't be cleared without completely disassembling the lock. From the outside, there was no visible sign of tampering. The keyhole looked empty, but the door had become impossible to open. British intelligence codenamed these devices Type 7 denial sticks. They were manufactured by the thousands in a secret workshop in Hertfordshire. Each stick was carved from a specific type of hardwood, aged and treated to prevent swelling or shrinking in different humidity conditions. The dimensions were precise to within 1/10 of a millimeter. Too thick, and they wouldn't insert properly. Too thin, and they wouldn't create enough friction to jam the mechanism. The Special Operations Executive, the organization responsible for sabotage and espionage in occupied Europe, began training all field agents in their use. The training was thorough. Agents practiced in darkness, under stress, with instructors timing them. They had to be able to disable a lock in under 3 seconds silently while running. The technique required a specific insertion angle and a precise amount of force when breaking off the stick. Too little force and it wouldn't jam properly. Too much and you'd risk bending the pins, which might actually make the lock easier to pick. Odette Sansom, the woman in that London office, became one of the first agents deployed to France with these devices. Her mission was to establish a resistance network in the Burgundy region. She carried 12 denial sticks, hidden in the false bottom of her cosmetics case. Each looked like an ordinary wooden toothpick. Even if discovered, they appeared completely innocent. Her first use of the technique came sooner than expected. 3 weeks after her arrival in France, her cover was nearly blown. A suspicious Gestapo officer began asking questions at the cafe she used as a meeting point. Odette had just made contact with a local resistance cell in the back room when she heard boots on the stairs. The only exit was through a door that opened onto a narrow alley, but that door would also allow the Germans to follow her directly. She reached the door in 4 strides. Her hand found a denial stick. Insert, angle, snap. The entire operation took less than 2 seconds. She pulled the door closed behind her and ran. When the Gestapo officer reached the door, 10 seconds later, his key wouldn't turn. He could see the alley through the door's window, but the mechanism simply refused to rotate. By the time a locksmith arrived 20 minutes later, Odette was 2 kilometers away, her identity preserved, her network intact. This scenario repeated itself across occupied Europe. In Norway, SOE agents used denial sticks to seal the doors of a heavy water plant after placing explosives, ensuring the German guards couldn't reach the sabotage team until after detonation. In Holland, resistance fighters trapped a pursuing SS unit inside their own headquarters for 45 minutes, allowing an entire network to evacuate. In Poland, an agent sealed himself inside a Gestapo communication center, transmitting intelligence for precious extra minutes, while officers hammered uselessly at the door from the corridor. The Germans knew something was happening, but they couldn't determine what. Captured locks showed no obvious damage. Locksmiths reported mysterious jams, but the wooden fragments often swelled from moisture or crumbled during extraction, leaving no clear evidence of sabotage. The Germans changed locks, installed new security systems, added guards. None of it mattered. The technique worked on every pin tumbler lock, regardless of manufacturer or security rating. The American Office of Strategic Services took notice. In late 1942, a British instructor traveled to a training facility in Maryland to demonstrate the technique to OSS operatives. Among the students was Virginia Hall, already legendary for her work establishing resistance networks in France. She had lost her left leg in a hunting accident before the war, but her disability never slowed her down. She practiced the denial technique until she could execute it perfectly while climbing stairs, while injured, while under fire. Virginia would later use denial sticks during her escape from France into Spain, when Gestapo units came within minutes of capturing her. She sealed doors behind her at 3 different locations during her flight through Lyon. Each delay bought her the time she needed to stay ahead of her pursuers. When she was finally extracted to London, she requested more denial sticks, better ones, refined for the locks she'd encountered in France. The workshops responded. Engineers analyzed samples of French, German, and Belgian locks. They discovered that while the basic pin tumbler design was similar, subtle differences in tolerances and pin configurations required slight variations in the denial sticks. They created different models, each optimized for specific lock types. Type 7 became Type 7A, 7B, 7C. Agents began carrying assortments, selecting the right stick for the right lock, like a surgeon choosing instruments. But the most remarkable development came from an unexpected direction. A Polish resistance fighter, working with stolen German blueprints, realized the technique could be reversed. Instead of jamming a lock from the inside to prevent entry, you could jam it from the outside to prevent exit. This became known as the denial trap. The application was devastating. Resistance cells would identify a building housing German officers or collaborators. A small team would approach at night and insert modified denial sticks into every exterior door lock. The sticks were designed to jam after a few hours, triggered by humidity change or a simple chemical timer. When the occupants tried to leave in the morning, they found themselves locked inside. Windows had to be broken, doors had to be destroyed. The chaos created opportunities for ambushes, for intelligence gathering, for psychological warfare. The Germans never solved it. Even when they captured agents and found the denial sticks, they couldn't develop an effective counter. Changing all locks in an occupied city was impossible. Adding additional locking mechanisms just gave resistance fighters more locks to jam. Guards could be posted, but guards had to sleep, had to change shifts, had to be distracted. The fundamental vulnerability remained. After the war ended in 1945, the denial stick technique was classified at the highest level. The British government, recognizing that the basic physics of pin tumbler locks hadn't changed, decided the method was too valuable to reveal. Documents remained sealed. Training manuals were destroyed. The few surviving denial sticks were locked away in vaults. But knowledge, especially useful knowledge, has a way of spreading. Locksmiths who had worked on jammed locks during the war put pieces together. Intelligence services in other countries heard rumors and experimented. By the 1960s, a version of the technique appeared in Soviet spy training. By the 1980s, refined variations were being taught to security professionals and law enforcement. Today, the method exists in a strange twilight. It's not exactly secret, but it's not widely published either. Professional locksmiths know it, security consultants know it, military special operations units still teach variations of it. But the general public remains largely unaware that a technique from 1942 can still defeat a lock purchased yesterday. The reason is simple. The fundamental design of pin tumbler locks has barely changed in over a century. Yes, we've added better materials, tighter tolerances, additional security pins, but the basic mechanism, the core vulnerability that the Belgian locksmith exploited, remains. Modern locks are better at resisting picking, better at resisting drilling, better at resisting impressioning. But the denial technique works on them all. Let me be clear about what I'm not telling you. I'm not providing instructions for jamming locks. That information remains restricted for good reasons. What I am telling you is that this vulnerability exists, that it was weaponized during the Second World War, and that despite 8 decades of lock technology advancement, the fundamental problem has never been solved. Why hasn't it been solved? The answer reveals something profound about security itself. To fix this vulnerability, you would need to completely redesign how pin tumbler locks work. You'd need to eliminate the keyway entirely, or change the relationship between pins and cylinder, or add sensors that could detect foreign objects. Each solution creates new problems. Locks without keyways can't use standard keys. Redesigned pin systems are expensive and not backward compatible with existing doors. Electronic sensors add complexity, cost, and new failure points. The economics of security always involve trade-offs. The denial technique is devastating against a single lock, but scaling it up is difficult and risky. You need physical access. You need the right tools. You need training. For most security threats, traditional locks remain adequate. The vulnerability is known, but the cost of fixing it exceeds the realistic threat level for ordinary applications. But for high security situations, the problem remains critical. Government facilities, military installations, critical infrastructure. These locations have spent millions developing countermeasures. Some use locks with inverted keyways. Some use cylinder guards that prevent insertion of foreign objects. Some simply accept the vulnerability and layer their security, ensuring that jamming one lock doesn't compromise the entire facility. The most sophisticated countermeasure I've encountered involves a modified lock design that allows authorized personnel to detect and clear jams using a special tool. The tool itself is classified, but the principle is clever. If you know what you're looking for, you can identify a jam before it becomes permanent and remove the obstruction. It's an arms race between denial techniques and anti-denial technology, and it continues today. The legacy of those WWII's denial sticks extends beyond physical security. The concept of weaponizing a system's normal operation, of turning a feature into a vulnerability anticipated modern cybersecurity thinking by decades. Buffer overflow attacks, denial of service attacks, privilege escalation. These all follow the same pattern. Find a normal system operation, push it beyond its design parameters, create a failure state that serves your purposes. The agents who carried those wooden sticks into occupied Europe understood something important. Security isn't about making things impossible. It's about making things difficult enough, for long enough, to achieve your objective. Odette Sansom didn't need to make that door unopenable forever. She needed 3 minutes. The Norwegian saboteurs needed 20. The principle scales. In computer security, we talk about threat models and acceptable risk. The terminology is modern, but the thinking is the same. Odette Sansom, by the way, survived the war. She was eventually captured, tortured, and sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. She never revealed her training, never compromised her networks, and refused to betray her fellow agents despite unspeakable treatment. She was awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian decoration, for gallantry. After the war, she rarely spoke about her experiences, but in a late interview, she mentioned those first seconds of her first escape. "I remember thinking," she said, "that everything depended on a piece of wood smaller than my finger. And then I remember thinking how brilliant it was that something so simple could work so perfectly. It wasn't about strength or weapons. It was about understanding how things work and using that knowledge at exactly the right moment." That philosophy characterized much of SOE's approach. While other organizations focused on bigger explosives, better weapons, and more soldiers, the SOE focused on leverage. How could one person disable a factory? How could a small team disrupt a rail network? How could a handful of agents tie down thousands of enemy troops? The denial stick was just one answer among many, but it exemplified the approach. The material science behind these devices deserves attention. The choice of wood wasn't arbitrary. Metal splinters would be detected by metal detectors that were beginning to appear in high-security installations. Plastic wasn't yet widely available, and early plastics didn't have the right combination of rigidity and brittleness. Wood could be shaped precisely, would break cleanly, wouldn't corrode or degrade quickly, and was completely innocuous if discovered. The specific species of wood mattered too. Different woods have different grain structures, different tensile strengths, different responses to humidity. The workshops experimented extensively. They settled on a tight-grained hardwood that had minimal expansion or contraction with moisture changes. This consistency was critical. An agent might carry denial sticks for weeks or months before use, through different climates and conditions. The devices had to work the first time, every time. Chemical treatment of the wood added another layer of reliability. The sticks were impregnated with compounds that prevented rot, discouraged insect damage, and stabilized the moisture content. These treatments were carefully balanced. Too much chemical treatment and the wood became brittle, snapping too easily during insertion. Too little and humidity changes could cause swelling, making insertion impossible or weakening the jam. The manufacturing process was surprisingly sophisticated for wartime production. Each stick was individually crafted, measured, and tested. Quality control was rigorous. A stick that was even slightly off specification could fail in the field, and field failure could mean capture or termination for the agent carrying it. The workshops maintained failure rates below 1%, remarkable for hand-manufactured items in the early 1940s. Distribution was equally careful. Denial sticks were never issued in bulk. Each agent received exactly what they needed for their specific mission, and each issue was logged. This wasn't about mistrust. It was about operational security. If denial sticks started appearing in unexpected places, the Germans might deduce their purpose and develop countermeasures more quickly. By controlling distribution, British intelligence could control the pace of German learning. The Germans did eventually figure out the basic concept, probably from examining jammed locks and piecing together agent reports. By late 1943, German security services issued warnings about potential lock sabotage. But understanding the concept didn't provide a practical defense. How do you prevent someone from inserting something into a keyhole? Guards can't watch every lock every moment. The only real solution was to change all locks to a different type, and that was economically and logistically impossible in the middle of a war. Some German installations tried adding keyhole covers, metal plates that swung over the keyway when not in use. These covers could be locked with a separate, smaller lock. But this just created a second vulnerability. Now there were two locks to jam instead of one. Other installations tried filling keyholes with putty or wax when the building was secured, but this slowed down authorized access and could be easily removed by anyone with a few seconds of time. The most extreme German response was to weld locks shut in facilities that were only accessed during specific shifts. Guards would cut through the weld when access was needed, then weld it closed again. This actually worked, but it was slow, noisy, expensive, and required keeping welding equipment available at every secured location. For most facilities, it wasn't practical. Meanwhile, the denial stick technique continued to evolve. British engineers developed spring-loaded versions that would deploy automatically when inserted to the correct depth. They created versions with delayed triggers using simple mechanical timers or chemical reactions. They experimented with versions that not only jammed locks, but also released small amounts of corrosive chemicals, permanently damaging the internal mechanism. Some of these advanced versions were never widely deployed. The simpler designs worked so well that there was limited need for complexity. The basic denial stick, requiring nothing more than correct insertion and a quick snap, remained the standard throughout the war. Sometimes the simplest solution really is the best solution. The psychological impact of these devices extended beyond their tactical use. German officers became paranoid about their own locks. Was every jammed door sabotage or just a mechanical failure? The uncertainty created stress, slowed response times, and tied up resources investigating false alarms. Resistance fighters encouraged this paranoia by sometimes jamming locks on buildings they hadn't even entered, creating the impression of more widespread resistance activity. This psychological dimension anticipated modern information warfare. It's not always about the direct physical effect. It's about creating uncertainty, forcing the enemy to expend resources on problems that might not exist, degrading their decision-making through stress and confusion. The denial stick was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. After the war, as the Cold War developed, the technique found new applications. Intelligence services on both sides used variations for agent extraction, for securing safe houses, for creating distractions. The KGB developed their own versions, reportedly more sophisticated than the original British designs. American CIA operatives received training in denial techniques as part of their fieldcraft curriculum. The basic concept, born in wartime desperation, became a standard tool of peacetime espionage. The technique also found applications outside intelligence work. Law enforcement agencies began using it for controlled access situations. Security consultants recommended it as part of layered defense strategies. Locksmiths studied it to better understand lock vulnerabilities. What started as a weapon became a teaching tool, a way to understand that every security system has weaknesses that can be exploited. Modern variations of the denial technique use different materials and mechanisms, but the principle remains the same. Some use specialized polymers that expand when inserted, creating a jam without needing to break off a fragment. Some use radio-activated triggers, allowing remote denial of access. Some use biological materials that degrade completely after a set time, leaving no evidence. The technology has advanced, but the underlying vulnerability hasn't changed. This persistence raises important questions about security design. If a vulnerability discovered in 1942 still works in 2025, what does that say about our approach to security? It suggests that we often layer new technology on top of old systems without addressing fundamental weaknesses. We add complexity rather than redesigning from first principles. The lock industry would argue that complete redesign is impractical. There are billions of pin tumbler locks in use worldwide. Retrofit solutions are the only economically viable approach. And they're right, in a sense. But it's also true that we've accepted a known vulnerability for over 80 years because fixing it is inconvenient and expensive. That's a choice, and it's worth understanding that we've made it. For high-security applications, alternatives exist. Magnetic locks don't have keyholes to jam. Biometric systems don't use mechanical pins. Electronic locks can detect abnormal resistance. But each alternative brings its own vulnerabilities. Magnetic locks fail if power fails. Biometric systems can be fooled. Electronic locks can be hacked. There's no perfect solution, only different trade-offs. This reality brings us back to the original lesson from those WWII operatives. Security is contextual. What works in one situation fails in another. The denial stick technique is devastating against a single locked door when you need immediate temporary inaccessibility. It's useless against a military convoy or an encrypted communication. Understanding when and how to apply specific techniques is as important as possessing the techniques themselves. The agents who carried denial sticks understood this instinctively. They didn't rely on a single method. They learned lockpicking for situations requiring silent entry. They learned explosives for situations requiring permanent destruction. They learned the denial technique for situations requiring temporary inaccessibility. Each tool had its place, its moment, its proper application. This flexibility, this deep understanding of context and appropriate response characterized the best operatives. Odette Sansom exemplified it. She could pick a lock or jam one. She could use violence or charm. She could hide in plain sight or disappear into darkness. Her survival and success came not from being the best at any single skill, but from knowing which skill to use when. The training programs that emerged from WWII experience recognize this. Modern special operations forces, intelligence agencies, and security professionals don't just learn techniques. They learn judgment, when to act and when to wait, when to use force and when to use subtlety, when complexity serves you and when simplicity saves you. The denial stick, in all its elegant simplicity, became a teaching example of this principle. There's a broader lesson here about innovation under pressure. The denial stick wasn't invented in a laboratory with unlimited resources. It was created in wartime, under resource constraints, with the immediate need to solve a life-or-death problem. Some of the most elegant solutions emerge from limitation, not abundance. The Belgian locksmith who developed the technique wasn't trying to revolutionize security. He was trying to save lives. He looked at an existing system, understood its fundamental operation, and found a way to exploit that understanding with minimal resources. A piece of wood. That's all it took. But it required seeing the problem differently, understanding the mechanism deeply, and thinking past conventional solutions. This pattern of innovation appears throughout WWII technology development. Radar wasn't a completely new invention. It was a creative application of existing radio technology. The atomic bomb required new physics, but the engineering drew heavily on existing industrial processes. The code-breaking work at Bletchley Park used early computing concepts, but most of the actual work was done with paper, pencils, and human ingenuity. The denial stick fits this pattern perfectly. No new technology was required. The materials had existed for centuries. The understanding of lock mechanisms was well established. What was new was the application, the recognition that a lock security mechanism could become its vulnerability with the right intervention. This insight resonates today. In cybersecurity, the most devastating attacks often exploit normal system operations rather than finding bugs. In physical security, social engineering defeats technological safeguards. In warfare, psychological operations achieve effects that require fewer resources than kinetic operations. The denial stick was ahead of its time in recognizing that the most effective exploits use a system's own mechanisms against itself. As the war progressed, denial techniques became part of a broader toolkit of access control methods. SOE agents learned to combine different techniques for maximum effect. You might pick a lock to enter a facility, place explosives, exit through a different door, and then jam locks behind you to delay pursuit. Each technique complemented the others, creating a complete operational capability. Documentation from the period shows sophisticated thinking about operational sequencing. Instructors didn't just teach isolated skills. They taught how to chain techniques together, how to plan operations that used each method at the right moment. The denial stick was never meant to be used alone. It was one tool among many, valuable specifically because it solved a problem that other tools couldn't address. This integration of capabilities is standard in modern special operations, but it was revolutionary in the early 1940s. Traditional military thinking emphasized overwhelming force and direct confrontation. The SOE's approach required different thinking. How do you achieve maximum effect with minimum resources? How do you multiply your capabilities through clever application rather than brute strength? The agents who mastered this approach became extraordinarily effective. Records show individual operatives completing missions that would have required dozens of traditional soldiers. They disabled factories without firing a shot. They disrupted communications without cutting wires. They created chaos without conventional combat. The denial stick, simple as it was, exemplified this force multiplication principle. By 1944, as the Allied invasion of Europe approached, denial techniques had evolved into standard operational procedure. Every agent deployed into occupied territory received denial stick training. Every resistance network had access to the devices. They'd become so commonplace that agents sometimes forgot how remarkable they were. Just another tool in the kit. Just another technique to deploy when needed, but commanders never forgot. After-action reports consistently highlighted the value of denial techniques in successful operations. Mission planners specifically incorporated lock denial into operational timing. Intelligence analysts studied German response patterns to jammed locks, learning how to maximize confusion and delay. What had started as an improvised solution had become a formalized capability. The D-Day invasion saw widespread use of denial techniques. Resistance fighters across France received drops of specialized equipment, including hundreds of denial sticks. As Allied forces advanced, resistance cells jammed locks on German facilities, creating chaos in rear areas. Communication centers found themselves locked from the inside. Supply depots couldn't be accessed. Administrative buildings became temporarily inaccessible. Each delay, each moment of confusion helped the advancing Allied forces. Historical analysis suggests these small delays had measurable strategic impact. When every minute matters, when coordination depends on rapid communication, when supply chains operate on tight schedules, even brief disruptions cascade into larger effects. The denial sticks didn't win the war, but they contributed to victory in ways that were disproportionate to their size and simplicity. After Germany's defeat in May 1945, Allied intelligence services conducted extensive reviews of SOE operations. The denial stick technique appeared repeatedly in reports as one of the most cost-effective capabilities ever developed. The return on investment was extraordinary. Minimal cost to produce, simple to train, reliable in operation, and consistently effective. Modern military analysts would call it an asymmetric advantage. In 1945, they just called it brilliant. The post-war classification of denial techniques reflected their continuing value. Intelligence services recognized that future conflicts would require similar capabilities. The Cold War was already beginning. New adversaries were emerging. The techniques that worked against Nazi Germany might work against the Soviet Union, against Communist China, against whoever the next enemy might be. The knowledge was too valuable to release. This decision to maintain secrecy has been controversial. Some security professionals argue that public disclosure would have forced improvements in lock design, ultimately making everyone more secure. Others contend that secrecy preserved a valuable intelligence capability for decades. Both perspectives have merit. What's certain is that the technique remained classified far longer than most WWII secrets. Even today, while the basic concept is no longer secret, specific details remain protected. The exact dimensions, materials, and insertion techniques used by modern intelligence services are classified. This suggests the vulnerability remains significant enough to warrant protection. It also suggests that despite 80 years of lock technology development, we haven't solved the fundamental problem. So what does this mean for you, for ordinary people concerned about security? First, it means that physical locks, even modern ones, have inherent limitations. They're valuable as part of layered security, but they're not impenetrable. Second, it means that the most effective security often comes from monitoring and rapid response rather than from passive barriers. Third, it means that understanding how systems work, really understanding them, reveals both how to protect them and how to defeat them. The story of the WWII denial stick is ultimately a story about knowledge. The Belgian locksmith's knowledge of lock mechanisms, the SOE's knowledge of operational requirements, the agent's knowledge of when and how to apply specific techniques, the Germans' lack of knowledge about what was defeating their locks. Knowledge mattered more than resources, more than numbers, more than conventional military power. This remains true today. In cybersecurity and physical security, in every domain of conflict and competition, understanding how systems actually work provides advantage. The tools change, the technology advances, but the fundamental principle persists. Know your systems better than your adversary knows them. Understand their strengths and weaknesses. Use that understanding creatively. The agents who carried those wooden sticks into occupied Europe were operating at the edge of what was possible. They faced an enemy with superior numbers, better equipment, and total control of territory. They survived and succeeded through knowledge, training, and the intelligent application of simple tools. The denial stick wasn't magic. It was applied physics, used with perfect timing. As we approach the end of this story, I want to return to that moment in London, 1942. Odette Sansom, looking at a wooden matchstick on a table, learning that this simple object might save her life. Did she understand in that moment that the technique she was learning would still work 80 years later? Did her instructor know that the vulnerability they were exploiting would never be fully resolved? Probably not. They were focused on immediate survival, on the mission ahead, on defeating Nazi Germany. But the legacy they created extends far beyond that immediate context. They demonstrated that security is never absolute, that every system has weaknesses, and that creative thinking can turn those weaknesses into advantages. The denial stick remains relevant not because we've failed to advance, but because some fundamental truths about security persist, regardless of technological progress. Mechanical systems have mechanical vulnerabilities. Complex systems can be disrupted with simple interventions. The most effective solutions are often the most elegant. Today, somewhere in the world, someone is probably using a variation of this technique, a security professional testing a facility's defenses, an intelligence operative executing a mission, a lock manufacturer researching vulnerabilities. The knowledge that began in wartime desperation has spread, evolved, and persisted. And somewhere on a shelf in a secure facility, behind multiple layers of access control, there's probably a box containing original WWII denial sticks, preserved as artifacts, as teaching tools, as reminders of what's possible when necessity drives innovation. Those wooden slivers, no longer than your finger, changed the course of history in ways both large and small. The story of the denial stick is a reminder that advantage doesn't always come from being bigger or stronger or better equipped. Sometimes it comes from being smarter, more creative, more willing to see possibilities that others miss. The Belgian locksmith saw a possibility in a lock's vulnerability. The SOE saw a possibility in that insight. Agents like Odette Sansom saw a possibility for survival and success. And that possibility remains, not necessarily in the specific technique of jamming locks, but in the broader principle. Every system, no matter how advanced, has characteristics that can be exploited. Every defense has vulnerabilities. Every advantage can be countered. Security is not a destination, but a process, an ongoing competition between those who build systems and those who seek to defeat them. The next time you insert a key into a lock, remember that beneath that simple action lies over a century of mechanical engineering, decades of security evolution, and one brilliant insight from wartime that still works today. Remember that simplicity can be powerful, that understanding matters more than complexity, and that sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones that work with a system's nature rather than against it. The secret WWII entry denial hack isn't really secret anymore. The basic concept is known, studied, and understood, but it remains effective because changing the fundamental design of pin tumbler locks would require rebuilding our physical security infrastructure from the ground up. And so we live with the vulnerability, we design around it, we accept it as part of the landscape. That acceptance is itself a kind of victory for those WWII operatives. They found a weakness so fundamental that it's still present 80 years later. They proved that knowledge and creativity could defeat superior forces. They showed that sometimes the most powerful weapon fits in your pocket and looks like nothing at all. The legacy continues, the knowledge persists. And somewhere, right now, someone is learning this technique for the first time, realizing that a piece of wood and an understanding of how locks work can still change outcomes, still create opportunities, still make the impossible possible. That's the real secret, not the specific technique, but the principle behind it. Look deeper, understand better, think differently. The advantage you need might already exist, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to recognize its potential, just like a wooden matchstick on a table in London, 1942.